Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Good afternoon, listeners. It is July 27th and it's a roasty, toasty day here in suburban Chicago. My phone puts it in the high 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which I confess to not knowing how much that is Celsius, but it's hot. Very warm. Nonetheless, I did have to go into campus today, so I'm walking home, which means that my normal time to record this podcast is back, so I thought I would take the opportunity. It's been a really good gaming month. I'm looking forward to doing my end of the month wrap up for you. There's a lot to talk about, and I thought I would give you a bit of a preview for that by doing a message from the deep. For those of you listeners who haven't heard one before, Message from the Deep is a evaluation and exploration of a game given when I've become very accustomed to that game, as opposed to the other kind of commentary I give on a game on this podcast is what I call shooting from the hip, which is generally a response after one or two plays of a game and an acknowledgement that I haven't sort of plumbed the depths of what the game has to offer. Message from the Deep is intentionally the other side of that. It's a suggestion that I have explored the game very thoroughly, and this discussion reflects on many plays instead of just a couple. I'm also pleased to share that this Message from the Deep is going to be about Legacy of Dragonholt, which last time I did an update for you, I think I had maybe one or two plays under my belt, maybe 3 or 4. But at this point I have 10. My wife and I finished the campaign, and so I'm able to talk to you about it. I will do my best to not provide any spoilers for the campaign, as this is a story-based adventure game, but no guarantees. So that said, Legacy of Dragonholt is a 2018 release from Fantasy Flight Games. It was created by Nikki Valens, who has become a bit of a rock star in the board game community this last year, having created a couple different interesting games. I've just heard a very positive review of Quirky Circuits, although I will say, while the review is positive, it did suggest to me that it's probably not a game for me. But that's another one Valens has coming out soon. That said, Legacy of Dragonholt is from Fantasy Flight Games, and it is a story-driven adventure game. Probably the closest genre equivalent it has would be a choose-your-own-adventure game. In Legacy of Dragonholt, each of the players creates a character in a traditional Dungeons & Dragons role-playing style. You get a character sheet, you get to pick a race and a class, and then from that you get a very simple creation mechanism where you get to pick a series of skills that fit your race and class. Those skills are designed to reflect the kind of character that you want to be, and to then allow you to succeed or have more options when certain kinds of challenges arise. My wife and I played 2-player, which was useful because we were able to kind of balance our strategic choices of skills reasonably well. I think having a 3rd player there wouldn't have hurt, but at the same time, significant sections of the game are driven by this choice mechanism. And the way this works is each player has a number of skills that they are able to use, and they have a decision token. For significant portions of the game, whenever a decision arises, the group discusses it, but one particular player has to make the decision, and that player becomes the active player until the next time that a decision token is called upon. And during that time, if the active player doesn't have a particular skill that's needed, they will often take a penalty. So, like for instance, if you encountered a cliff that needed to be climbed, and your character didn't have agility, you might not be able to choose to climb that cliff, even if one of the other characters did, because it wasn't their turn to decide. So that would be a kind of example of that. Usually the game will often sometimes give you a couple choices and sometimes just give you one. So it ends up becoming a kind of mix of different possibilities. You also will pick out a story for your character, create some philosophical background, like things that you think about what your character is like, which maybe will help you decide what direction to take in the story. So on to the story itself. Legacy of Dragonholt is a sort of bog standard fantasy scenario centered around a town. I don't want to say much more than that, but it's pretty well written and it's got lots of interesting corners. So as far as a guided role-playing game scenario without a DM to improvise, it's pretty solid. The storytelling is robust and well written. We often would enjoy, there is a lot of reading. This is definitely a game where you pick a person or you take turns. We didn't really take turns because when my wife and I play games like this, she reads them aloud. That's just how we do it. But the reading aloud portion is significant in this game. So it's probably not a game to play if you don't want to do that, or if you have people who aren't going to be comfortable reading out loud, you don't want to make them do it, because that's a huge part of what the game is. Because this is set in a fantasy world, it's able to accommodate without problem a significant level of casual representation of things that wouldn't be casual in our world. In particular, cross-race relationships and same-sex relationships are depicted pretty much as viable and welcome without comment. And it's a nice change, because even I'm, as an enlightened person who welcomes representation of lots of different kinds of relationships in my media, it still doesn't happen with frequency enough in mainstream media that it's created without comment. And one of the things I like about this story is that not only are, say, same-sex relationships basically created without comment, as like, these are two people that are in love, so there they are, but also there are some gender-flipped or unexpected or unusual gender role elements for different characters. That's a nice change of pace. The high fantasy sort of realm is often still populated by regressive stereotypes. So this is a nice change in that regard. I also really like the story development process. So the actual mechanism that you play is using these large storybooks. There's one large storybook that gives you the events in the town, and then a series of small storybooks that involve particular adventures that spring out of your time spent in the town. Aside from the character sheet that I mentioned at the beginning, you also have a party sheet that one player uses to track the experiences you've had in all the different stories. And the central portion of that tracking is a huge grid, maybe, I guess it's 26 by 10. So it's the entire alphabet and then 10 squares per letter. And when things happen in the story, it will tell you to mark a particular box on that sheet. And then at different story points, it will say, if such and such box is marked, then read this passage. And if this other box is marked, go read the other passage. Like Sherlock Holmes' consulting detective, there are lots and lots of entries. And so there might be concerned about sort of wandering eyes. But here is where the volume of entries really works to the advantage of a Legacy of Dragonholt. There's so many possible things you might find, and they're organized entirely randomly, that it's very rare that you would accidentally see something you need. As opposed to Sherlock Holmes, where when you're going to look up, 221B Baker Street, and you accidentally see that 220B Baker Street, there's a whole bunch of text. Well, you know something interesting is going on there. Because the text entries are organized in a random way in these booklets, and because the entire adventure is mixed into one large book, it's much harder to accidentally find something that you need and ruin the adventure for you. That said, there is an awful lot of flipping around and reading things in the books. So like I said, all of those are pretty positive parts of the experience. There were a few things that I guess just weren't as good as I was hoping they could be. So the first one is that this made me want to do more role-playing, not less. The game at the beginning has you come up with a very robust outline of your character when it doesn't really need to. The game doesn't give you opportunity to role-play. I suppose if you really lock down the idea of your character's motivation and use that to drive your decisions in the story, that would be one thing. But most of the time that you have decisions to make, it's kind of clear what you want to have happen, and your character personality wouldn't really shape that. It's far more likely that the decisions you're making are shaped by the skills you have. So I found that a little hampering, that most of the game we were more often gaming whose skills are likely to benefit us in this section, and so which one of us should take the action first, rather than, oh, my character does this or that. Every now and again I would make a decision focused on the way I imagine my character, but the game didn't really provide that many role-playing opportunities for you. And in that regard, there's very little player involvement in the story itself. Like a choose-your-own-adventure novel, you are navigating through what is a very complicated story, but ultimately is a story where you're choosing your adventure. And you're making lots of choices that connect in different ways and open up different possibilities. But narratively, you aren't role-playing anything, that you are just making these choices. That said, it's a delightful and enjoyable version of that. But it should be clear, this is much closer to a choose-your-own-adventure than it is to a traditional tabletop role-playing game, to my money. That said, there are quite a few spaces where the choice that you have to make is pretty wide open, as opposed to, a choose-your-own-adventure novel, you get two choices. And while that will sometimes happen in the midst of a story point where you only have a couple choices, there are many times where you have literally dozens of choices that you could make about what you're going to do next. And that way it feels more like a role-playing game. Finally, the last thing I want to comment is a structural one. There are, I believe, 6 scenario booklets, and then the large town book that you get to use as you're playing Legacy of Dragonholt. We, in our normal course of the adventure, and it took us 10 sessions, we had a couple where we stopped in the middle and took a break and then started again. We had a couple where we didn't have one of the scenario sessions appear. We just did the main town book. That said, we did get to the end of the story without having done all 6 of the scenario booklets. And that's kind of frustrating for a game with as limited choices as it has, to also then not get to do the whole story. So we actually went back. I looked up online how to find the story that we missed, and then we went and read the story that we missed as though we were encountering it in the middle. Because, like I said, there's just, you're going to play it once. You're not going to play it again because the story's done. I guess you might play it again to try to win it, but to me that feels silly. So, that would be the other downside, is that it's possible to not get the whole story, to miss pieces of it, if you just don't make the right choices or don't pick up on the right cues. That said, a good choice-based story should allow you to miss things. So I suppose maybe I'm complaining without reason. Well, that's about all the time I have today. Hopefully you'll let me know what you think of Legacy of Dragonholt if you've played it. If you haven't, what other story-based games of this ilk have you explored? I apologize about the very noisy end to the episode here. Hopefully you can still hear me talking. I don't really have a way to work around that, so I'm just going to power through. Pop over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know what experiences you've had with choose your own adventure type story games. And let us know what you've been playing. Thanks for listening. I hope to talk to you again soon, and hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.